Hello and welcome to this Info Security Magazine webinar. My name's James Coker, Deputy Editor Info Security Magazine, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's session, which is sponsored by Outpost 24. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to be discussing the topic vulnerability management, why a risk-based approach is essential. Before I introduce you to our panel of speakers, there's just a couple of quick housekeeping points. We'll be running a few polls throughout the session, so please do join in with those as and when they appear. No right or wrong answers, we're just very interested to get your views. Also, please do use the submit a question function to let us know of any questions you might have, and also to let us know if a question is for a particular presenter, and we'll do our best to answer those later on in the session. And a quick note about CPE credits. This webcast qualifies listeners for 1 CPE credit based on the minimum attendance time of 50, that's 50 minutes. And once you've done that, you can download your certificate from your Info Security account and submit it, and further instructions can be found on the event platform. And please note, certificates take 48 hours to be processed and will be made available to download the following day. So crack on with the session. I'll just introduce our speakers. Firstly, we have Stuart Beattie, who is Product Marketing at Outpost 24. We have John Stock, who is Director of Product Management at Outpost 24. We also have Lee Munson, who is Principal Research Analyst at the Information Security Forum, and Holly Grace Williams, who is Managing Director at Akimbo Core. So thank you very much, guys, for joining us today. I'm just going to start by launching our opening poll question of the afternoon, which is, what is the biggest challenge you experience with vulnerability management? And the options for this are A, patching the volume of vulnerabilities, B, gaining oversight over all the changing IT assets in the organisation, C, lack of resources such as modern tooling and lack of staff, or D, other. So we'll leave that running for the next 15 minutes or so please do send in your thoughts. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Stuart and John, who will be giving us an opening presentation. Over to you, guys.
Great, thanks very much, James. So the topic of vulnerability management, why a risk-based approach is essential. So before we actually dive into the main topics, just a quick word about Outpost 24. As you can see, we are founded in 2001 in Sweden, over 300 employees worldwide, and we cover a whole range of security solutions, including password management, allowing you to block weak passwords and secure user authentication, mapping and analysis of your external attack surface to discover vulnerabilities of known and then unknown internet-facing assets. Also, web-based application security testing that allows you to test applications in real time for the latest vulnerabilities. And finally, also have a risk-based vulnerability management solution, which obviously we'll be talking a lot more about today, that allows you to prioritize your vulnerability remediation across your entire organization. As you can see, we have over 2,500 customers in 65 countries, and 58 of the Fortune 500 companies already rely on Outpost 24. So before we get started and actually look at vulnerability management and the challenge we actually have, I think it's important to kind of set the scene and look at the reliance on digital systems. All of us in the on this call, I suspect, have some sort of digital transformation projects that we're actually working on at the moment. They may not be called digital transformation, but there'll be certainly things happening. There's a whole load of examples I could give. I've just put a few up there to give us some ideas as to things we're looking at. Data insights. Many organizations are looking to achieve competitive differentiation by using data more effectively. And this could be customer and prospect data, looking at how we can sell more information to customers, how we can take information to sell and service customers better. Or it could be more operational type of data, monitoring machinery, watching out for potential failures and performing maintenance before we actually have a failure of a machinery. So overall operational efficiency. The next two, innovation and customer engagement, closely tied. Innovation could be developing new products, new online products for customers, or it could be better ways to service customers as well. So I'm thinking about things like e-commerce sites or web portals for customer service, self-service, so that customers can actually get answers much quicker. And that has the benefit for the customer of getting the information quicker, resolving their issues quicker, and it also makes it more cost-effective for us as organizations to service customers. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the remote workforce as well. As many of us have moved to either completely remote or hybrid working. That obviously adds pressures to the digital systems as well, needing more cloud-based infrastructure and/or having access, VPN access and access into internal systems as well. So this increase in the reliance on digital systems, as you can see there, many benefits around cost saving, cost and efficiency savings, competitive advantages, etc. But it also has quite a few challenges in that by relying more on digital systems, we have more systems, and we have the potential. We actually have to make sure that they're up and running, they're secure, etc. Especially as we're putting more and more data into these systems. So an interesting statistic that I found, the average security team is responsible for managing over 165,000 assets. Obviously different in each organization, but it's a significant number. And I think more important than the actual number itself is that we're seeing that increase due to just the sheer number of more devices that are coming on, either individuals having more devices or just more servers to support our digital infrastructure in there. So clearly a challenge there. And this leads us to think about the more so the evolution of the vulnerability landscape itself, as well as the sheer number of devices increasing. The diversity is also there as well. We're seeing a lot more mobile devices, Internet of Things, cloud assets being used, and also just third parties connecting into our assets as well, which could expose us even more. So an opportunity for these sophisticated threat actors to attack, and these actors are becoming more sophisticated as well, much more organized than when I started my career. Script kiddies, 14-year-olds in their bedrooms just doing basic things. A lot more sophisticated, a lot more of an operation. And that means that it's a bigger challenge and more threats for us to actually look after, as well as the sophistication. And on the other side of things, we'll get a lot of regulatory pressure as well, seeing a lot more pressure to actually report quicker when breaches, when we discover breaches, and obviously the associated penalties as well. So a pretty bad, pretty dire situation it seems. And also we have, I don't think I need to mention that we have fewer staff. We don't have enough staff to actually deal with these vulnerabilities. So we need to be working a lot smarter. And just to go on to the actual vulnerabilities, here you can see the number of CVEs over the years increasing steadily or not, as the case may be. And already it looks as though certainly 2023 is going to surpass 2022. So it's an increasing situation of vulnerabilities that we have to actually deal with. And if I just split those out into the actual severity based on the CVSS scores, this is a common way that organizations try and prioritize what they're actually the vulnerabilities that they're going to address. Clearly thinking that the higher the threat, the technical threat, the more likely, the better, it's good that we should actually tackle those first. So last year, 25,000 for the full year, 25,000 plus vulnerabilities. So if I split out, let's just say the 8 to 10s, it's a good way for many organizations to say that's their particular risk appetite. It's an improvement, as you can see, but there's still, 5,009 and 10s and 3,008 and 9. So it's still a significant number of vulnerabilities that we have to tackle. So clearly, this traditional way of vulnerability management isn't actually going to hack it, and isn't going to actually allow us to get on top of this situation. So what do we have to do to address this? This is where we're looking at this risk-based approach. And I think this Gartner quote actually sums it up quite nicely, insofar as it's a risk-based approach about prioritizing the remediation. I think that's a key thing, prioritization. But how do we actually prioritize that? As I say, the CVSS scores not sufficient. We need to look at two things really: the imminent threats, so threats that have a valid exploit that can exploit the threat in the wild, and a business critical assets that are important to us as an organization. So looking at those two things are really going to give us the way to prioritize in a much more sophisticated way than just looking purely at the CVSS scores. So again, a nice chart from Gartner that talks about the elements, the components of vulnerability prioritization that we have to actually look at. So the first one being the asset exposure. Is the asset that we're talking about actually exposed to the wider internet, or is it hidden behind security? Is it hidden behind layers of security internally? If it's exposed, then clearly there's a lot of threat actors out there. It could be a target for a lot of threat actors out there. Another asset from an asset context is the potential business impact. If that vulnerability on that asset was to be compromised, what would that mean to the organization? If it's our e-commerce server that's generating our revenue, all of our revenue, clearly that's a business risk, but it's also probably got personal information associated with it, credit card information, etc. It's probably a high risk. Whereas we'll say within Outpost 24, if it's the cafeteria menu, then it's not as important. Myself and John both argue that actually that's just as important as an e-commerce server. No, seriously though, it's less of a business risk if that actually is compromised. And also, what's the context of the vulnerability? I've already kind of hinted. Is there a vulnerability in the wild already? Is an exploit for the vulnerability already? Is it just a proof of concept, or indeed has no vulnerability, no exploit actually being created for it? Depending on that level, and also, is it being talked about on the internet as well? Are the attackers talking about it, discussing how it could be exploited? If there's a lot of conversation going on, it's probably of interest, something that we need to look at. And finally, we shouldn't forget the severity. We shouldn't forget the CVSS score. That is, although it's not the only thing we should be looking at. If it is more severe, if it is up there in the 8 to 10 range, then it's a priority we have to look at, providing these other things are relevant as well. So just to summarize what we're looking at here, we're understanding the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited and the business risk to our organization. So from a business risk point of view, we've identified the assets, those that are critical to the business, and those that are exposed directly to the internet. And for the vulnerabilities, we've looked at the context, we've looked at the CVSS score, and we've used additional threat intelligence to actually determine whether it's whether it's something that we should actually be concerned about right now. So if we put these two things together, we can kind of come out with a kind of risk analysis. You can see here, I've drawn my risk appetite at a particular place. Clearly, that's different for each organization, but I think it's clear to say here that my risk 1, it's highly likely to be exploited, and the business impact would be severe. So this could be, this is a critical asset that contains personal information, PII data, and it's exposed to the internet. Clearly, that's something that we need to address. That's a high priority for us to address from a vulnerability point of view. The second one, R2, again, still internet facing, still very likely to be for the vulnerability to be exploited, but it's got a lesser business impact if it is actually compromised. So that could be, let's say, an informational website if it's actually compromised and defaced. Okay, so it's embarrassing to the organization. It's not ideal, but we don't lose any critical data. We don't expose ourselves to regulatory fines, etc. Because of it. But it's still something that we should actually something that's important to the organization. And finally, potentially behind the firewalls and of a less risk is our canteen menu. It's unlikely to be exploited, partly because it's behind the firewalls, maybe a lesser type of vulnerability, and business impact is less than our e-commerce server and our customer-facing websites. So what we've done here is we've taken a look at the different assets based on a whole lot more information than just the vulnerability score, and that will depends on the organization, but that will significantly reduce the number of vulnerabilities that we have to actually look at, and allows us to target those vulnerabilities that are going to impact the business directly. So just to summarize, the challenges we're facing are an increased reliance on the digital systems. There's no getting away from it. We're putting more and more online, relying more and more on the systems to perform our business, regardless of what the business actually is. The landscape, the threat landscape, and the vulnerability landscape is getting greater and greater over time. An increased number of vulnerabilities, which realistically means there's no chance of us keeping up with or patching everything, and certainly getting to things in time before they're exploited. So the solution is we're actually prioritizing based on a risk-based vulnerability management approach, based on the likelihood for an exploit to do harm, and the likelihood of the vulnerability actually being exploited within our organization. And with that, I'd like to hand over back to James, and I believe we're going to go through onto the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. Really interesting overview there on this increasingly vital area of cybersecurity. Before we dive into the panel discussion, I just want to take a quick look at the responses to the opening poll question, which, as a reminder, was what is the biggest challenge you experience with vulnerability management? So the highest proportion, 47%, said gaining oversight over all the changing IT assets in the organisation. 23% said patching the volume of vulnerabilities. 23% also said lack of resources, such as modern tools and staff, and 5% said other. We'll touch on those results shortly. I'm just going to quickly launch the second poll question to kind of run through the first part of our panel discussion. So this question is, does your organisation undertake a risk-based approach to vulnerability management? And the options for this are A, yes, we use business context to prioritise vulnerability remediations. B, no, but this is an approach we're looking to adopt. C, no, but I'm interested in learning more. D, no, we do not have the resources or expertise to undertake this. Or E, no, this approach is not necessary for our organisation. So that's live. And once again, please do send in your thoughts. And a quick reminder, you can submit any questions for our panel via the question function. So to kick off the panel discussion, Holly, perhaps if I could start with you. I just wanted to firstly ask you on your sort of reflections really on the first poll results, and more generally, what do you see as the main challenges for organisations currently in identifying and remediating vulnerabilities?
Yeah, definitely. I think my views on the poll is it's not overly surprising. Getting oversight over the changing IT assets in the organisation, I think that's a very well-worded statement, because there's a big difference between knowing how many assets you have and having a spreadsheet that says we have 250 laptops, and in detail understanding those assets. So knowing what the configuration of those assets should be, knowing what data those assets store, and then importantly for this risk-based approach, understanding the criticality of those assets to your organization. A simple example that I see people very often make a mistake with, just a very simple example, would be having something like a file server and saying this is a very critical asset. In a business continuity context, we'd have to bring this up very quickly, but then not considering what does that asset depend on? What is its authentication system? And then even physically things about like power, cooling, storage, all of those things. So like, yes, the file server is important, but to make the file server available, there's probably other things you need, like possibly some cloud service like Azure AD, or maybe an on-site domain controller or something like that. So that was the first thing that I think like, yep, unsurprising, but maybe the asset management problem is a little bit deeper than some people have considered it to be. And interestingly, from Stuart's talk, I was furiously taking notes as he was going through. One of the things that I liked that he mentioned was about things like where a system, maybe you don't consider that system critical because it doesn't store important information. And perhaps sometimes as cybersecurity professionals, we hyper-focus on things like confidentiality of data and PII, but harm can be caused simply by things like website defacement. And a lot of companies that I work with on the penetration testing side of things, when we look at things like their brochureware websites, they might say, oh, you know, they're a companyname.com website. Oh, we don't worry about that. It doesn't store any PII. It's like, okay, so if I just replace it with offensive messaging, whatever that means in your context, be that political, adult in nature, or just something that says, you know, lol, you got hacked, that's going to impact you. And I think that I love the way that Stuart said, you know, define the impact and the likelihood of exploitation, but under impact, you got to clearly define what harm is, and it's going to be more than just, oh, somebody stole some confidential information.
That's really interesting, Holly. Thank you. And Lee, I saw you nodding to some of that as well. Yeah, if I could ask you the same question and your reflections on those thoughts.
Yeah, again, I'm not overly surprised by the poll results. I've recently done a research project on vulnerability management, and asset discovery and management was probably the biggest challenge everyone faced. There were also those issues around staffing that were mentioned as well. You know, adequately trained people to perform the scans. But an interesting one that came up that surprised me a little bit was communication and collaboration between security and other business units, and also that sort of relationship with business stakeholders as well. If you want to contextualize against the business, you need to understand the business and the overarching strategy.
Thank you very much, Lee. And John, I was wondering if you had any thought. Oh, I think John's dropped off there. Stuart, I don't know if you had anything to add to those points.
No, I would certainly echo what Lee's just said. Actually, I think that, you know, understand that business context is so and actually, you know, what Lee and Holly both said. You know, business context, defacing a website. What does that, you know, what does that mean to your business? It's not PII data, but it's still very important to some people from that point of view. So I think that communication with the business, it's a big challenge, but it's got to be achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I think you're back with us.
I am back. It's kicked me out, but I just wanted to add that another thing that Stuart said that always I think is not considered enough is risk appetite, right? It's always that, and I think I've used the example way too many times in my life that, yeah, I would never go bungee jumping because I'm terrified I'll die. I used to go scuba diving, but now I'm older and a bit scared of that kind of thing because there's quite a big danger in that. But I drive my car every single day to work for when I go in the office, 40 minutes, or if I'm just going to go buy a coffee from the coffee shop, it's 5 minutes. But the most dangerous thing I'm doing there is driving my car. You know, more people die on the roads or are injured in the roads than there are bungee jumping every year. And, you know, it's like 1 in a million to 1 in 250,000. And my risk appetite is completely skewed, right? I should be more scared of driving my car and more happy with bungee jumping and that's often what people forget when they're looking at their security is they're like, well, what is my risk appetite? What am I willing to accept is a risk? And all the things like loss of PII and things, we worry about them. And then, like Holly said, you forget about the website defacements. You forget about all the, losing a laptop that someone said, oh, it's a bit slow if it's encrypted. So as I'm working at home and not traveling anymore, can you just decrypt my laptop so it speeds up? And it's a C-level. No one wants to say no. They probably have the most confidential information. Then they go and sit in that coffee shop that's 5 minutes away, forget their laptop, and there's a problem. And it's that, you get a little bit blasé of, I'll be fine. And it's just understanding not only, how bad something would be, what is your appetite as an organization for risk? What can you happily go, yeah, that's fine, or go, panic.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And perhaps Lee, if I could go back to you, what do you see as kind of the common mistakes or misconceptions organisations have in their vulnerability management? Is it around that understanding that risk appetite piece?
That's certainly part of it. And to go back to the presentation, I'd pick up on CVSS scores. You see a 9, and that is an indication of the potential severity, but it says nothing about the exploitability. You need more context, you need more environmental factors to feed into that to make that a meaningful metric.
Thank you. And Holly, same question to you.
Yeah, I think there is a big point there about very often organizations want to hear from us on pen tests, CVSS base scores, but then they don't add those additional metrics in, that, like Lee said. And in fact, my perspective with working with companies is they just entirely discard the fact that those additional metrics, exploitability, environmental scores, things like that even exist. They're only ever working on base scores. I think that's definitely a takeaway for organizations, is that CVSS scoring, there is 2 sides to it, or possibly even 3 sides to it. There's what the security researcher or your security expert is saying. Maybe there's input from something like NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, in terms of what they have recorded as a second independent view. And then there's also your understanding of your own systems. Stuart made a big point there about the additional layers of protection that you've put on those assets. Are they internet facing? Are they protected by additional layers of security like a VPN, those kinds of things? It impacts those scores. And very often that is just entirely ignored from a CVSS point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of just touching on the getting that business context that you guys have been mentioning. What's kind of your main advice? Perhaps John, if I could start for you, what's your main advice for organisations to sort of start going about getting that business context, especially if they're kind of new to developing such a program?
It's easy. Don't imagine you're going to get the whole organisation sussed out in a week. That's the first mistake people make, is like, this is easy, right? I'll just go through, and then suddenly there's a server room you didn't know about, or there's a whole platform that's in a cloud environment that you didn't know about. And people think, I can go through, get business context, that'll be quite easy. No, start small, right? It's like, get that business and I wish there was an automatic way I could give our customers the business context of every asset they have to say, this is a user's laptop. Some things are quite easy, but then, this is a firewall that's protecting a dev environment that's for test. It's probably not that important, but also it's probably less patched. So if it does get compromised, it's a lot easier to pivot onto all the other things. So to be able to get the business context, it's knowing the right people to talk to and knowing that they understand the business context, because security teams, right, we don't know. Yeah, I've done, before I worked in vendor land, I had a real job, worked for a power company. And you know what, we knew about certain things, but put me in front of some of our mid-range or our mainframe stuff and start talking about RACF, I was just like, I am so out of my comfort zone. I don't know if that's hyper secure or completely open to the internet. It's, but I knew people who did. So that's the thing, is know the right people, but don't imagine you're going to do the whole thing. Start with what you perceive to be the critical things for your organization. And as soon as you start there, someone will tell you you're wrong and that you should look at this. And then you'll go look at that. And then they'll tell you you're wrong, that actually you should look at this. And suddenly that you're going further and further down the rabbit hole. And at some point you pop out the other end and look behind you and go, okay, I've got 75% of the organization mapped of what business criticality is. And I guarantee, even when you've got that, it will change the next day because someone's thrown something up in the cloud, or, you know, there's someone's, sorry, Stuart, but the marketing team have gone and done a big marketing thing, and it's all hosted by a third party in AWS, but with your company name plastered all over it and no security. So it's not an easy thing, but it's just start small.
Brilliant, thank you. And Lee,
Can I just
oh, sorry, Holly.
really tiny? Just because John mentioned it, that people leaving laptops on trains and things like that. I'm ex-military, and one of the things that always makes me laugh from my military career, there was a newspaper headline I wanted to read from you from 2008. You know, civil servant fined £2,500 for leaving secret Al-Qaeda files on trains. Like that was back when I was still serving, but it's like that stuff happens very often. We're hyper focusing on the cool stuff, and we're talking about things like vulnerability exploitability. We're using threat intelligence to work out, are any of these threat groups able to develop an exploit for this very technical security issue? And then sometimes there's just the human aspect, not in terms of the human aspect that we're often talking about with phishing and scam emails and things like that, but people making mistakes, or put another way, processes allowing for people to make mistakes.
And there's a really good cartoon that someone whenever I'm using example data, I use the name Dave, because there's a really brilliant cartoon of a boxing ring, and it's saying in the blue corner, we've got firewalls, IDFs, vulnerability scanning, all that saying, and in the green corner, we've got Dave. And yeah, Dave, the user, who doesn't matter how many tools and products you have, someone leaves their laptop on a train and that goes straight out the window.
Cheers, guys. And Lee, I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on kind of advice to organisations on gaining that business context.
Yeah, I think actually it's somewhat simpler than that even. Sometimes security teams need to stop looking at vulnerability management through the lens of a technical problem to be fixed, realise it's a business issue, and when they're having these meetings with business leaders, remember they're a two-way conversation. It's not just about reporting and metrics. It's about understanding where the business is going and that overall strategy and how that fits into the VM program.
Thank you very much, Lee. I just wanted to move on to talking a bit, well, it's a topic that all seems to get discussed in every context at the moment, but sort of the use of AI and automation, and in particular its role potentially in helping organizations develop and utilize those risk-based vulnerability management programs. Holly, perhaps I could start with you. Like how much of a role can AI and automation play in this domain, and do you use it in your own work?
I'm glad you pointed out the work that I perform, because I don't want to stomp too much on where I think Stuart will maybe likely want to talk here about the work that they do. So yes, AI has a great place within process automation and within the vulnerability management side from the defensive side of things. But I would just like to put a couple of details here on the offensive side, what we do on penetration testing. So one of the ways that we use AI that I think defensive teams could learn a little bit from is when we compromise a network and we're propagating across a network and we're trying to demonstrate, like, how do we leverage this access that we've got? One of the things we might want to show is loss of PII. So can we steal data and exfiltrate it from a network? And to do that, we need to find that PII. Where is it stored? You might have a network share called, secret files. Probably not. You might have data spread across the network and much messier than that. So we use AI to scan networks to find files that contain PII so that we can then exfiltrate them from a network and demonstrate data loss and demonstrate the risk of a data breach in that way. Of course, those same techniques could be used internally to scan your own systems to say, okay, where is our data in places that it shouldn't be? So users doing silly things like storing PII on desktops or on open network shares, or one I've had recently, a very simple one. A HR team had an open network share where they were storing all of their employee records. And of course, one of the things you need for employees is the right to work within the UK. And some of the documents for proving that is things like passport, scan of your passport. So yeah, we're finding those things because, the HR is not focused on security; they're focused on another business requirement there. So yeah, we're using AI in offensive ways, but I think defensive teams could be using it more as well on the automation side of things.
That's interesting. And yeah, just to pick up on that last point, John, is that something you're seeing a lot, and is it being used but in your team as well?
So AI is always a fun one, because when I bring it up in a conversation with customers, they either run for the door or they settle down with a coffee and know we're in for a long chat. It seems to be, it's quite a regional thing as well. In some geographical areas in Europe, when you mention AI, they're like, out my door. Don't leave my office. AI is not for us. We don't trust it. It's never coming past our door. Go. And others, it's like, that's the coolest stuff in town. Tell me what you're doing. So it's very, and I think it's discussed it before, is that people just assume that AI is ChatGPT, it's OpenAI, it's all these things that have got the big noise around them. There's part of ChatGPT where you can ask it to generate some stupid images, and we had a hackathon over in our headquarters, and we got some, for the prize certificate, we used AI to generate some cool images of people doing hacking, and it was pretty cliche, to be honest, but it was just fun to get an idea, and it's great fun. But I'm not going to put all my vulnerability information into ChatGPT. I might ask it how I word something for a PowerPoint slide that I'm trying to put together. And, being dyslexic, ChatGPT is the best thing in the world because it helps with language. It helps me put things together. And then Stuart comes along and goes, that's junk, John. This is how you should write it, which is brilliant. That's not as good as a person. But, AI is not ChatGPT. It's not OpenAI. There's a lot more to it. And I think in security terms, people are still seeing that if we say, hey, look, we've got AI generate this, they go, oh, does that mean all my stuff's going straight over to ChatGPT or in OpenAI and anyone can search it? And no, this is not. So for us, it's still an investigative thing. It's still something we're playing around with internally to say, hey, how can we? And one of the perfect ties in is business context. How can we use AI to look at your business context and say, hey, look, based on the information we can find about what we're seeing in your organization, this is your corporate website, this is your menu, this is a laptop owned by a CEO. So rather than just having to go through trudging a load of data, how can AI make these decisions for you? So they're not necessarily making the security decisions. It's looking at, providing the business context. And again, what we were saying earlier, we're security people are supporting the business. The business isn't a security organization, and that's trying to make that simpler.
Yeah, thank you, John. Stuart, I was wondering if you had any other thoughts on that.
No, I think everyone's cleared everything there. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to stay on this AI piece a little bit longer, Lee, I just wanted to ask you really about what do you see as kind of the biggest challenges organizations seem to face in kind of utilizing sort of AI tools in security and in particular vulnerability management programs at the moment?
Actually, throughout all my research, I didn't find anyone who was using AI and ML with vulnerability management per se. Right. The closest I got to it was actually some pen test companies using AI to write their reports.
I can throw in something that we do with AI, which is really useful. Natural language processing for vulnerability information. So if we have a huge amount of information about an organization, and I want to be able to say things to our machine learning algorithm in plain English, like show me every asset that has a high impact vulnerability against it. Show me every asset that has a high impact of vulnerability against it that is newer than the last 7 days. One of the things that's often overlooked with machine learning and AI is that kind of basic automation side of things, where we're not talking about generalized intelligence. We're just talking about improving the interface into the system in some way. And I think that's one of the benefits that we could see in the future with vulnerability management is just you have a huge amount of data about your systems and being able to query that data in quite a human way with something like natural language processing. That's one of the basic things that we do aside from the hunting data.
Yeah, really interesting. I was wondering if any of you guys sort of had any thoughts on how it may be used in this field in the sort of coming months and years, even potentially.
I think it lends itself well to threat intelligence and threat hunting. to find anomalies, find patterns, etc.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. It's the same kind of thing what I'm talking about here, where I'm talking about vulnerability information, but if you just have information about the way that your assets are being used, then threat hunting. I haven't seen anybody talking much about ML use within threat hunting, but I definitely would expect within the next few years that would be a growth area, just because it's what I would call a machine learning problem in terms of it's a good place that machine learning could give a benefit.
Yeah,
and I think AI and machine learning around language, like you don't have to learn a query language, you can just ask it. And I think exactly what Holly said. It's make it a simplistic thing. And that was when you talked about that, I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that one, because that's one of the things, one of the things we've always getting is, can we have a nice simple query language in the product? And it's like, yeah, of course. Now we're kind of moved on to, no, let's not do that. Let's see if we can do natural language query language, just ask questions and we'll come back with the answers. And it's moved on from, hey, give me a really cool query language that I can write, because it says, just let me ask a question and I want the answer back. And if you can put that into the TI data, the threat intelligence data, it's like, hey, how many times has my organization been talked about on the dark web? How many times? And I'm going to invert the commas of dark web, because a lot of people talk about it as, hey, are we mentioned on the dark web? It's like, well, it's not quite that simple. But it's the cool words right now, right? It's not the latest buzz thing. But have any of our organization, based on this host, we are outpost24.com, how many of our email accounts have been compromised? How many of them have had the password successfully cracked? Are any of these people still employees that we still have within our Active Directory? That would be a really nice one.
I think something that would be interesting to see, based on what John was saying earlier, is how security companies market this stuff in the future. So we've seen a couple of years of people saying we have AI, and everybody saying we have AI, but not really fundamentally talking about where is it, what are you using, what capability does it bring. And then John mentioning, interestingly, saying, oh, his experience within Europe, where if you say AI, they shun it and they're not interested. I wonder if maybe we'll see a walking back of that. So instead of saying AI, we'll step down to say, well, it's machine learning, and we'll step down to that to just say something like, we have a human readable query language. Now, in actuality, we know that's natural language processing, but I wonder if we'll move away from this and hopefully talk more about the capability that ML is giving us, as opposed to saying, "Ooh, magic black box, artificial intelligence."
And the other one is, someone I mentioned machine learning. Someone they like, it's just a clever if then else statement, right? If this then that, and if it's something else, then it's another thing. And that's kind of, we would need to get away from the simplicity, but not just bundle it all under AI, which can scare people and isn't quite as cool as people think.
Yeah, I read being on the marketing side, I read an interesting article a couple of weeks ago about exactly that, the kind of the tangibility of it. As Holly said, it's the AI buzzwords across the whole IT industry, the AI kind of side of things. This article is really interesting on exactly that. We need to roll back and talk about the actual tangibility. What can we really do? What's the output that's actually most valuable? So I think there will be a rolling back of things like you said, things like the human readable query language as a phrase instead. I think it's very valid.
We just need to drop off this call and trademark that phrase.
Yeah, I like it. Done already. No.
Darn it.
No, there's a lot more playing about and learning in this space to come for sure. I just want to pop out just to take a quick look at the answers to the second poll question, which, as a reminder, was, does your organization undertake a risk-based approach to vulnerability management? And kind of a big majority said yes, we use business context to prioritize vulnerability remediations at 76%. 7% said no, but this is an approach we're looking to adopt. 7% also said no, we do not have the resources or expertise to undertake this. And 7% said no, this approach is not necessary for our organization. John, I just wonder if I could get your thoughts on that result. Is that you just kind of see that as kind of encouraging the
as I say, it's encouraging, right? It's if people are moving away from that, it's a CVSS 10, I now have to run around and panic. I remember back in my old days, there was a CVSS 10 came out of Internet Explorer, and that over time paid for my first car. So, there's things like that. There's a massive security vulnerability in Internet Explorer. Okay, I'm going to buy a car with the weekend I'm working, helping fix that one. That from to where we are now, well, actually, it affects Internet Explorer, but given the business we do and the way we use that, and it's locked down, and we don't actually have everybody with internet access, because these were the days where not everyone had internet access. It's not that big of a deal, unless our intranet was compromised. It wasn't a bigger deal. So that idea of that, more people are taking that business context, and those that are looking to approach it, do it. It makes your life so much easier. It just stops you panicking about the things that actually they're not worth panicking about it. And those who say you don't have the resources or expertise, actually, you're probably slightly doing it without really knowing it, because if you've got a high risk vulnerability on your corporate website, you probably are like, oh, we need to fix that. Yet something more internal, you're probably like, well, it's not so important, we can do that with our natural patching cycles. So often you find people are doing some context of it without really realizing that they're actually undertaking that risk-based approach. It's just how you can extend that out into the rest of the organization without using all of your resources sat there asking people questions.
Thank you, John. And just to pick up on that resourcing point there that came through in the question, Lee, perhaps if I could start with you. Do you kind of see with organisations that you work with that resource challenges are an issue in terms of vulnerability, sort of that risk-based vulnerability management approach? And what advice would you have for sort of overcoming those issues, particularly kind of smaller, less resourced organisations?
I have seen those issues, but it's not so much about people. It's more about tooling, having efficient and effective tooling. For smaller companies, the advice, they're probably right for talking to a vendor rather than trying to do it themselves. Larger companies have the resources to take care of it better.
Yeah, that's true. And is that something you see in your work, Holly?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things, there's that scale of company where they have a couple of guys in the security team. Maybe they've got like one person in security, 2-3 people in security. Where they can often feel very tight in resources is those people are effectively tasked 100% of the time. And so they might not be able to free up time for additional learning. And we might be talking here about, hey, here's some interesting ways that ML is developing, here's some interesting tools and ways that you can implement them. And it might be just be simply that they don't have the time to go away and learn about that kind of thing. And I think that's something that a business should be taking on in terms of, where possible, when you're hiring these people into technical roles, you need to allow some slack in the calendar for them to keep those skills sharp and to learn new things, or you'll very, very quickly fall behind the curve. And I think I would love to know how much of that 7% is just people who like, hey, when we say under-resourced, I just mean if I had 5% more time in my calendar so I could do that learning, we'd be in a much better place. But they're running 100%, and that's it. You're one tiny step down from everybody burning out.
Thank you, Holly. And it was also, it was interesting to see, obviously, a very small proportion sort of mentioned that this approach is not necessary for our organisation. John, I was wondering what you thought the reasons for that might be, and what perhaps comments you would have for organisations, personnel that think that.
Yeah, I mean, it could be various reasons, right? If you're a small organisation of, not a lot of people, then maybe, it doesn't matter which is high risk and low risk, you can fix them all in the same day. So it doesn't really make much difference if you have a risk-based approach or not. You can still do the fixing in the same amount of time. Some organisations just find that, when they have a lot of SaaS platforms, then they have kind of taken away that security problem from them and put it on the SaaS providers. So when people log into our SaaS platform, they hopefully they're not worried that if this has been patched today, do we need to check that? They don't care. We do the patching. That's our problem, not theirs. Now, I'm not going to say cloud platform, because there's the shared security model of, hey, AWS, for example, they'll patch the underlying infrastructure, but anything you put on there, you're responsible for. And I've found a lot of companies kind of miss that. Not a lot, a handful I've spoken to, they're like, oh yeah, no, we're all right because we use Amazon and Amazon take care of all the patching. And it's like, not really. How about the stuff you deploy? Yeah, they sort. No, they don't. Oh, so yeah, there's that risk of missing things there. But sometimes it's just, if you know what everything is, maybe you're already doing it and know everything's critical, right? Or there's or you're all in SaaS. There's just a lot of different reasons why that may not be the best one. But for most organizations where you've got a lot of employees and it's a mix of infrastructures, it can make things a lot easier.
I have an example of where an organization might think that they fit into that category when they won't. And it's kind of what John was hat tipping at there is, if you're an organization that is either small enough to or has good enough automation that you're just installing everything on a fixed time cycle. So maybe you're looking at something like, hey, Cyber Essentials says we have to install all patches within 14 days, but you know what, our automation's great. We do them all within 7. That's awesome. But what if you have one of those very rare vulnerabilities where when it is first publicized, it is being actively exploited in the wild? So if you think about something like Heartbleed, now Heartbleed was many years ago in 2014. When that first came out, it was like public disclosure, 6 hours later, publicly available exploit tools. And if you're sitting there thinking we don't need to worry about a risk-based approach to vulnerability management because all of our security updates will go in every 7 days, well, in those very rare instances, 7 days isn't fast enough. So if you have a good process like that and you're leaning on automation in that way, or you've just got enough people that you can handle that, consider those where when it is publicly disclosed, it's either already being exploited in the wild or it is going to be, units of hours. They are very rare, but in those cases, you still need some mechanism to break that process and say, no, this one has to go in immediately.
And Heartbleed is a brilliant example there because I remember where I was when it's one of those, I remember that day. And I was on a pen test in Turkey, of all things, and we used it to great advantage. I was sat in with a couple of my colleagues writing exploits for that in a hotel room. And we were and they were like, well, it's only just come out. What, we're not supposed, and it's like, well, it's just come out. There's active exploits available. We've written some ourselves, particularly for your environment. So maybe you should be patching quicker. Yeah. It's an example of something's come out and it's really bad. And that is, you led me into that one perfectly because I'd forgotten about that. But it was one of those great successful days that you're like, yeah, that was fun because something came out and we were sat there writing exploits for it all night and went in the next day and went, you're vulnerable to this thing in all these places. And they're like, well, of course we haven't had a chance to patch. It's like, well, maybe you should have come in last night and done the patching.
Yeah.
I do also wonder if that small percentage are super agile, fast startup companies where they're rushing to market and they have an incredibly high risk tolerance.
Oh yeah, yeah. Our risk appetite greatly exceeds any value of data we hold.
That's true. Thank you very much, guys. I also wanted to ask, perhaps Lee, if I could come to you. How can organizations kind of develop the processes they need to ensure risk-based vulnerability management is an ongoing business function that's continuous?
Well, that's a whole big program and process developed there around vulnerability management and patch management. Of course, remembering that patch management is not vulnerability management, which is a common thing I've seen along my travels. It's just having that laid out process and a continual process at that takes in asset discovery, vulnerability management, prioritization, remediation, and communicating back to the business as well. It has to be a two-way street.
Yeah. John, anything to add to
that? Lee stole my thunder on the communication one there because that's the thing, right? It's a lot of times you see security teams work a bit in isolation because everybody hates the security team. It's just a natural reaction. And everyone who works in security is used to being the most hated person in the world because you're the one who says no. But at the end of the day, you need to communicate with the other teams to make sure they're also involved and that you're telling them why there's a risk and they're understanding it. And I think the one thing I learned from having a real job outside of vendor land was you've got to talk the language of the people that need to understand the risk, right? If I go to a marketing team and say, yeah, this is really bad because your SSL certificates are weak and you're using weak encryption, that doesn't really, okay, yeah, bad vulnerability. Okay, I get that. But if you start saying, well, actually, that means that when someone's logging in, or so someone else can get their password and log in as them, and then maybe they can defraud the customer or us, and that's a really bad thing. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, we should fix that. So it's having that eureka moment in the different parts of the business so that they understand what the risk means, rather than just go, it's an SSL certificate problem. It's really bad because, yeah, even I get confused with SSL, and I've been working in it for years. So yeah, half the time I just like find a story that works for that person or that team.
Thank you very much, John. And we're just inside the final 5 minutes of the session. So I was thinking I might just come around to each of the panelists in turn, just ask you for your final thoughts and advice for organisations around sort of establishing and managing vulnerabilities going forward, as we see threats obviously increase and growing reliance on digital infrastructure. Lee, could I start with you, perhaps?
I'll probably just go back to what I just said and what John also jumped in on, and that is the fact that vulnerability management is not just a technical security problem, it's a business problem, and you need to communicate and collaborate.
Thank you very much, Lee. And Stuart, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, reiterate that as well. And I'll also say something mentioned, be paranoid. The business is going to be doing things. John kind of joked that the marketing department will be doing something. Be paranoid. You will have missed something. Even if you've got everything, which is unlikely tomorrow, something will have changed that you need to be keeping on top of. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Holly, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, I think whilst companies are taking a look at their vulnerability management processes, a separate thing that should run alongside that is looking at your system hardening. There's an awful lot of activities that we see. So working with companies as a penetration tester, very often we're focusing on vulnerabilities and particularly those that are exploitable. But there's a lot of stuff you can do to break exploitation or make exploitation harder. A web security example here might be something like content security policy. It's like, hey, you should fix cross-site scripting, but also you should look at these system hardening protections like content security policy. I think very often that hardening step gets ignored because we're focusing on high risk, because we're focusing on CVSS 10, because we're focusing on everything that we've been talking about before. And the system hardening stuff is a bit of a longer, slower burn. And yes, this is the stuff that will keep you up if something happens tomorrow. No one can go home until we fix this vulnerability. No weekends until the problem's solved and John's buying another car. But you still need to have somebody thinking about that longer term strategy of system hardening, breaking exploitation, and making it harder for attackers to leverage in the first place.
Brilliant, thank you. And John, finally.
Well, I'd just like to point out it was a pretty bad car. A Ford Fiesta XR2, so that gives me a nice aging component there. But I would say don't think you can do it all. You start small and grow in the organization when you're looking at the risk of areas. Don't assume, I'm going to get the risk for our organization. Look at the risk in certain components and just assume that you will gradually get everything. And also, because you asked for one, so I'm going to give you two, is that don't assume that just because the people on the inside have your best interests at heart. A lot of people assume because it's internal, it's a bit less of a risk. Actually, over the summer, you find the number of CVEs found rockets because all the school kids with way more intelligence than me and more time on their hands than me are breaking stuff, and they start getting work in call centers and stuff, and they're like, I'm bored on a call center, I'm going to start poking around. It happens. I've seen it happen way too many times. These kids are so intelligent. It's Raspberry Pis when they're at 5 at school. It's amazing, but they've got a lot of cleverness, a lot of things going on. But they haven't necessarily got your best interests in heart. They're looking for themselves. A lot of people are, make sure they're okay. So just because something's internal, and even though we said it's exposed to the internet, it's really bad. There's billions of people on the internet, but actually you still got thousands of people in your organization who are potentially poking at the same holes and probably know a little bit more inside information as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, 2 for the price of 1 there. So yeah, much appreciated. And afraid that's all we've got time for today. But I really enjoyed that session. So really Big thank you to John, Lee, Stuart and Holly for your time and your insights this afternoon. A big thank you as well to Outpost 24 for sponsoring this webinar. For details on upcoming Info Security Magazine webinars, please see our website. And remember, you can rate this session, tell us what you liked or areas you'd like us to perhaps improve upon in the future. But with that, thank you everyone for listening today, and this session is now ended. Thank you.